Lovely. Looks like we are live at the moment, which is great. Excellent. Okay, right. So this is it. We're good to go. Yeah, okay. All right. So this is our first keynote of GIFCon 2023, which is absolutely great. We've got to this first sort of key point of the conference, and it's a great pleasure to welcome today my own colleague, Will Tattersdill, to give this first keynote. So Will is a senior lecturer in contemporary fantasy at Glasgow University and the author of Science, Fiction, and the Fin de Siècle periodical press, which was published with Cambridge University Press in 2016. He has taught and written on alternate history, museology, animals in Star Trek, all sorts of cool things. And he's currently editing H.G. Wells for the Oxford World Classics series. Also, his first children's Choose Your Own Adventure book, co-written with Sarah Crofton, will be published by Ashburn this July. The cover looks amazing. You should all have a look at that. So really a great pleasure to be welcoming Will to speak to us today. And the title of his keynote is Breathe Deep, Seek Peace, the fantasy/science boundary, especially as it applies to dinosaurs. Over to you, Will.
Thank you so much, Dimitra. I'm actually, I'm gratified that you mentioned the title of my book there, because that's kind of pertinent science fiction with the comma between them. It's that comma that I'm talking about today, really, in some ways, and that is kind of at the heart of everything that I'm going to say. Okay, so I'd like to begin, of course, by thanking the GIFCon committee for inviting me to speak. Some of you already know that I'm quite new at Glasgow. I've worked here since January, so the organisers have had to deal with me at a time when I've been busy learning how everything works, and I've made a few mistakes, so thanks to them for their patience, and thanks to all of you for tuning in to listen. I see we have 68 of you. The terrible thing about live streaming a lecture is you can watch people walk out of the room in real time. People seem less inhibited by that sort of thing than they are in a real lecture theatre. So let's see how many of you there are left in about 40 minutes. Thanks as well for your indulgence. My angle on the theme of boundaries and margins is perhaps going to seem a little abstract compared to some of the work we've already heard today. The boundaries I'm focusing on in this talk are the ones which separate fields of study, the academic disciplines, from each other. At what point is one no longer practicing literary criticism, but rather history? Where exactly does chemistry turn into biology or physics into chemistry? Most central to this particular talk, when is one in the realm of science more broadly? And when are we in the realm of the humanities? These divisions may feel less politically urgent than the boundaries between peoples or nations, but disciplines are often better thought of as communities rather than as bodies of knowledge or repositories of technique. For a literary critic, which is what I am, to speak to a scientist requires, in some senses, the learning of, or at least a concession to, another language. So though the stakes may be lower than in other kinds of boundary crossing, and though they may also not be, the act is often analogous, and the consequences can be far-reaching. Another analogous boundary, which we've probably all thought about, at least passingly, is the one between the genres of science fiction and fantasy. There we go. So often shelved together by booksellers, these two communities, let's think of them as that, rather than as bodies of knowledge or repositories of technique, sometimes feel like one, and sometimes like 801. Some adherents spend a lot of energy trying to separate them. Others see them as part of a unified project, sometimes called speculative fiction or fantastica. Texts like Tamsin Muir's Locked Tomb series cause chaos by setting necromantic magic and emperor-oriented sword duels on spaceships in the distant future. Where's the line? Who says so? Can it be moved? Does there have to be one at all? Zoom to any resolution, and we can see parallel issues sprouting. Do you know your hope punk from your solar punk? Your second from your third wave ska? Welsh from English cuisine? The sciences have given us terminology for how we engage with this sort of thing, the terminology of lumping and splitting. In biology, you're a lumper if you essentially believe that new species should be described parsimoniously, that 4 very similar-looking fossils might simply be from one species rather than needing lots of separate names. After all, humans are lots of shapes and sizes, and the fossil record is notoriously patchy. Maybe Nanotyrannus, described as a species in 1988, is just a baby Tyrannosaurus rex. The current consensus tends, incidentally, towards the idea that it is. For a splitter, the tendency is the other way, because assigning too broad a range of individuals to a species causes the species itself to become meaningless as a way of understanding nature. The species becomes what they call a wastebasket taxa, like Megalosaurus. No complete skeleton of Megalosaurus has ever been found, but so much material has been assigned to it over the last 150 years, it was one of the first dinosaurs described, that the name now verges on meaninglessness. We can only understand biological variation, a splitter would argue, by admitting difference into our ecological models. Are you a lumper or a splitter? If we concede to this question, then we agree to yet another boundary, yet another attempt to split the world into 2 camps. In my experience, few people lump or split consistently. We vacillate. And that vacillation, I want to suggest to you, forms a significant part of how people order their worlds, at least in the West, at least since the Enlightenment. We taxonomize. Taxonomies are useful things, whether we're trying to understand chemicals, organisms, or languages. And the taxonomy that makes possible my phrase, chemicals, organisms, or languages, is no different. It's materially useful to have a genre called fantasy, which helps authors to sell books and helps readers to find the ones they like. It's materially useful to have a system for grasping the fossil past, which breaks down the incomprehensible vastness and chaos of deep time into something which can become, eventually, a children's picture book or a museum exhibit. The problem with taxonomies, of course, is that they make us overconfident. We can fool ourselves into thinking that we really understand something. This slightly unfriendly introduction has been my attempt to tell you what's at stake in the notion of boundaries for my specific research area. Boundaries are a product of how we organize ourselves, and also, more problematically, of how we organize everything else. At some point, you need them if you want to cure cancer, for example. At other points, like if you want to compare the Locked Tomb series to a Tyrannosaurus, they get in the way. And so we vacillate, lumping and splitting. As for the margins, they arise, in my understanding of them, from the other problem with taxonomies, which is parochialism. Once you have a Tyrannosaurus, it isn't long before you have Tyrannosaurus people. I don't mean people who dress up as Tyrannosaurus, although it turns out that you do also get these, but people who devote their study to that particular part of the family tree and to whom all other dinosaurs are puny and uninteresting. My very good friend Sam is a paleoichthyologist. She studies fossil fish. To her, dinosaurs are crass, boring, and hog all the grant money. Throwing up walls creates rivalries, especially in competitive funding environments. And so you get the biologist who won't talk to the paleontologist, the organic chemist who won't talk to the inorganic chemist, the historian who won't talk to the critic, the Derridian who won't talk to the new historicist. I'm painting a ludicrously reductive picture here, of course. But my point is that taxonomies can create silos as well as communities. If the world is made entirely of football teams, it's very hard not to, at some point, pick a side. With no apologies at all to Wordsworth, we dissect to murder. It's through this process, of course, that our target genre for this conference, fantasy, has wound up excluded from so many academic conversations over the last century plus. Fantasy books, until quite recently, have not been fair game for people training in English at university. They simply aren't serious. They aren't real literature. I expect we're all used to some form of this one. What is real is realism, or what Le Guin called the work of the so-called realists, a canon and style defined against the popular by the ability of its prose to address real life, as if Dickens or Woolf or Atwood make no use of the fantastic, the extraordinary, and the impossible. This fight, the fight of Le Guin's life in some senses, is a boring one, and I'm pleased to say that it is largely won, And we can, on the whole, talk at university level about some of the more interesting questions which fantasy tables without worrying about its marginal status. But let's remember that we vacillate. Fantasy may have been excluded for decades, but it was and is also the excluder. A whole genre of Tolkien's seen a certain way, pushing everything non-European, non-medieval, non-male, non-white out to the edges. We've already seen today, in my case, especially in Dimitra Nicolaidu's paper in the D&D panel, the profound ways in which this vacillation has shaped the genre. I'm sure we'll hear many more examples before the conference is over. So whilst the subject boundaries I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about might feel a bit esoteric, I hope I've convinced you that they do matter, if not for their practical effects, although they do have practical effects, then for the ways in which they operate analogously to other and more urgent divisions, which we all need to worry about. This belief underpins the book I'm currently writing, which is called The Social Dinosaur, and which will essentially, if I ever finish it, ask what dinosaurs do across a range of knowledge and genre systems, from fantasy fiction to technical scientific publications. The book asks what it would mean to try and comprehend the dinosaur as a phenomenon, the whole thing. What would we need to know in order to really understand that word? We need to know paleontology, of course, and geology. These days, we'll also need ecology, computer science, genetics, and so on. But if we want the whole thing, then we'll also need economics, the history of art, social science, film studies, and yes, literary criticism, because dinosaurs are a human thing, as well as being a thing from which humans are completely and inevitably absent. They vacillate. My argument is that in the dinosaur, we have an animal that moves relentlessly and, more important, easily across all kinds of boundaries all of the time, from your kids' bedspreads to stately homes, prestige docuseries to internet erotica, desert rock to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. They get everywhere. That makes them useful if you're interested in boundaries. Like I said, the book is ongoing. Frankly, it is, and I suppose I deserve this, all over the place. But one of the strange things I've found writing it has been that although a lot of the material has proved shifting and elusive, I figured out the two epigraphs I wanted to use almost instantly, and I've never changed them. Epigraphs are those quotations in italic at the start of books or chapters which everyone ignores, but which authors quite like. I think the idea from an author's perspective is that they effortlessly condense the argument of the whole volume. That's true of mine, for sure. So there are two epigraphs in this book that I haven't written. Here's the first one. The traditional culture, which is, of course, mainly literary, is behaving like a state whose power is rapidly declining, standing on its precarious dignity, spending far too much energy on Alexandrine intricacies, occasionally letting fly in fits of aggressive pique quite beyond its means, too much on the defensive to show any generous imagination to the forces which must inevitably reshape it. Whereas the scientific culture is expansive, not restrictive, confident at the roots, the more confident after its bouts of Oppenheimerian self-criticism, certain that history is on its side, impatient, intolerant, creative rather than critical, good-natured and brash. Neither culture knows the virtues of the other. Often, it seems they deliberately do not want to know. The resentment which the traditional culture feels for the scientific is shaded with fear. From the other side, the resentment is not shaded so much as brimming with irritation. Snappy, isn't it? This is C.P. Snow, diagnosing his version of the art-science boundary in an influential article called The Two Cultures. I'll say more about it in a moment, but first, I'm sure you're desperate to know about my second epigraph for the book. Here it is. Breathe deep, seek peace. The motto of James Gurney's Dinotopia, which I've also for this talk. What does it mean to try and make these two quotations, one from an American picture book published in 1992, the other from a scholarly controversy coming out of Cambridge at the end of the 1950s, talk to each other? My hope is that the answer to this question will help you see the value of dinosaurs in addressing abstract questions of disciplinary demarcation with respect to fantasy literature. But before we come to that, I'm going to spend a moment describing both of these odd texts so that we all have a sense of what we're dealing with. And many of you will know some of this already, but I want to try and lay it all out for everyone. So thanks for bearing with me. And before I get stuck into it, by the way, I should say that I can see things are popping up in the chat, but I don't have the resources to read them as they're going. So I'm looking forward to digesting them later. Okay, so let's start with the second example, Dinotopia. Set in the 1860s, but published in the 1990s, on an isolated island surrounded by treacherous reefs, implicitly somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, Dinotopia, there it is a tour through a fantasy society in which humans and dinosaurs live in peaceful and collaborative harmony. Though it did not achieve the dizzying sales figures of Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park, which came out 2 years earlier and was boosted, of course, by the 1993 movie to over 12 million US sales by 1999, Dinotopia was far from unsuccessful, selling, and this is a quote, 2 million copies in 18 languages in over 30 countries, and spawning, last time I counted, 3 sequels, 16 tie-in young adult novellas by various authors, 2 adult fantasy novels by Alan Dean Foster, a TV miniseries and 13-episode follow-on, an animated feature film, and 5 video games. I probably missed something. On the whole, the quality of these spin-offs varies in proportion to their proximity to Gurney's artwork, the distinguishing feature of the original book. Dinotopia is not simply an illustrated story. The art is crucial to the tale, not just interpreting the text, but contributing to our knowledge of Dinotopia, showing incidents and details that the words do not. And I should add here that Gurney is an artist first, so he writes this book because he ends up drawing this art rather than the other way around. Those of a certain age will recall that this, the early 1990s, is the great era of the Dorling Kindersley Look Inside series. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Dorling Kindersley is also Gurney's publisher here. In a way, this is a look inside for a fantasy world. The plot feels relatively secondary to the first book, which is more interested, as I read it, in giving you a tour of this place where dinosaurs and humans coexist. By the way, with the idea of boundaries in mind, I've sometimes been challenged on the idea of discussing dinosaurs under a fantasy heading with the idea that they are, as products of science, inherently science fictional. That claim itself is one I could talk about at considerable length, but I defy anyone to tell me that Gurney's book isn't a fantasy, a particularly lucid and beautiful one. Breathe deep, seek peace is the island's official motto and recurs throughout the series. It's even the refrain of the Dinotopia song, which appears with score and lyrics on page 109 of the first book, in case you're in any doubt that Gurney is making a multimedia attempt at world creation. Here's the explanation of the phrase as it occurs in text. Breathe deep has its origins with the dolphins, who long ago learned to survive by carrying deep draughts of air into the darkness of the waters. This greeting has found its way into many Dinotopian customs. For instance, the Dinotopian word for marriage or close friendship, come-spiritic, literally means breathing together. Seek peace comes from the dinosaurs, a reference shrouded in the mists of their history. The phrase then, breathe deep, seek peace, embodies the human-dinosaur alliance, dolphins carrying the survivors of shipwrecks over the island's perilous coral reefs are the catalyst for bringing humans and dinosaurs together and starting the Dinotopian civilization. But the really provocative thing Gurney is doing here, at least for me, is attributing the seek peace part of the proposition to the dinosaurs themselves. I already mentioned that this book was published between the Jurassic Park novel and movie. It also comes a few years after the epoch-making animated film The Land Before Time, 1988. What characterizes both these other dino texts is an understanding of the world of the dinosaurs as inherently aggressive. And in this, they act robustly in keeping with the entire history of dinosaur representation all the way back to the Victorian period. From Arthur Conan Doyle to Edgar Rice Burroughs, from the earliest movies to the pages of the pulps, to see a dinosaur is to be immediately and brutally attacked, or at the very least, to watch them murder each other. This situation abides today. despite the efforts of shows like Prehistoric Planet to portray dinosaurs as the animals they in fact were, capable of violence, but much more usually found sleeping, getting out of the rain, or playing with their young. And if you haven't seen Prehistoric Planet, the second season of which is coming out soon, I really do recommend it. And so do most of the paleontologists I know, which is quite unusual. In this monsterized context, where most of us need active reminders that dinosaurs were not sapient horrors, but parts of ecosystems, Gurney's work stands out all the more, attributing Seek Peace not just to a dinosaur text, but to the dinosaurs themselves, seems to me a radical step, all the more so in the early 1990s. But for Gurney, the dinosaurs of Dinotopia are a civilizing force, aligned with classical antiquity, especially Rome. The sharp-eyed amongst you will have noticed that in my earlier quotation, the Dinotopian language is aligned with Latin, cum spiritic, for breathing together. I referred this matter to a classicist friend who informs me that conspiritic would have been a little better, but that the translation is more or less sound. The dinosaurs have triumphal parades. This is actually the first picture that Gurney worked on before it was even going to be a book. He painted this. And imperial marble lines the streets of the capital Sauropolis, lizard city, of course, in loan words from the Greek. All of these things sit not only in sharp distinction with our traditionally primal impression of how dinosaurs are meant to behave, but of course in absolute harmony with the book's other declared genre association, which is that of the utopia. Gurney presents the human dinosaur society as an idealized world, and though it has its struggles, especially in later books, it is, I think, portrayed essentially as a success. The ambiguity is there, as it was in Thomas More's original Utopia of 1516. Utopia, of course, meaning both no place and homophonically a good place as well. If we forget that dino is usually these days an abbreviation of dinosaur, we can translate Dinotopia as terrible place. Dinosaur is usually, and was in the 1990s ubiquitously, translated into English as terrible lizard. But there is a twist even here, since when he coined the term in 1842, Richard Owen was using dinos in the sense better translated not as terrible perhaps, but as fearfully great or awesome. This utopian ambiguity is a great way of showing what I hold to be the fundamental characteristic of the social dinosaur, which is its both and facility. Considered as a whole, dinosaurs are both terrible and great, both peaceful and violent, both human and inhuman, both monsters and animals. It is this ability to transcend boundaries between supposed opposites, which makes them such excellent tools in the study of literature and science, or, to return to C.P. Snow's language from my first epigraph, the two cultures. So, the article that I quoted from was from the 6th of October, 1956 New Statesman, but the more famous launch point of Snow's argument was the Reed Lecture, which he gave later at Cambridge on the 7th of May, 1959. In this lecture, he argued that, quote, the intellectual life of the whole of Western society is increasingly being split into two polar groups, end quote, groups that we now usually shorthand to sciences and arts, but which Snow calls literary intellectuals and scientists, and as the most representative, the physical scientists. What's more important is the boundary he identifies between the two, a gulf of mutual incomprehension, sometimes, particularly among the young, hostility and dislike, but most of all, lack of understanding. They have a curious, distorted image of each other. Their attitudes are so different that even on the level of emotion, they can't find much common ground. Snow considered himself qualified to diagnose the problem because he had experience both as a practicing scientist and as a successful novelist. And moving in both circles caused him to notice a marked difference in the kinds of speech and knowledge which were valued. In perhaps the most famous part of the lecture, Snow recalls talking to literary sets who are unable to tell him the second law of thermodynamics. To them, the question is baffling. Snow reports, quote, "Yet I was asking something which is about the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare's?" End quote. It became fashionable to lambast Snow's position almost instantly. F.R. Leavis made literary intellectuals look bad when he replied to the lecture in 1962, saying, among many other things, that Snow was, quote, "as intellectually undistinguished as it is possible to be," end quote. Half a century of scholarship has pointed out all kinds of flaws in Snow's analysis, in his thinking, in his qualifications, in his idealism. In the field of literature and science studies, a rebuke of the two cultures has become almost a shibboleth. It's the model you need to set yourself against in order to have legitimacy in the area. In all of that mess, I think it's sometimes overlooked that Snow didn't like the position either. He merely identified it. And however considerable the weaknesses of that identification, it was successful enough that decades later, two cultures is still a working shorthand for the boundary between arts and sciences for people who have never heard Snow's name. And actually, I think that some of the people I know who experienced the two culture split most vividly are undergraduates who often live with scientists and yet have difficulty convincing them of the value of what they do, literature undergraduates. Now, don't get me wrong. Despite my reluctance to condemn Snow outright, I still think the publication of this lecture has ultimately been a damaging thing, if only because it gave the idea of a monolithic split between arts and sciences a snappy term around which to condense. Perception creates reality. And for many of today's literary intellectuals and physical scientists, the idea that there is no common ground is not even a proposition, it's a presupposition. The logistics of the 21st century university, unfortunately, do little to challenge it, despite the increasing trendiness of interdisciplinary work with funders and hiring committees. At the end of the day, most universities are organized both in the world, geographically and architecturally and conceptually on paper as well, in ways that make it very hard for sciences and arts to communicate with each other. This then is the pedigree of the idea with which I started, the idea of both conceptual and literal boundaries on campus created by the separation of knowledge into discrete and, more importantly, incompatible realms. For me, any sensible rejoinder to the two cultures model has to begin not with what science and literature might have to say to one another, but with what they are already saying. What are we prevented from seeing, in other words, by the silos we have built for ourselves? What if we read literature and science without assuming that those two things were polarized factions, irreconcilable, at war? What if disciplinary division wasn't a history of primal violence? What if we choose to follow Gurney's Dinosaurs, to seek peace? Let's go back to Dinotopia with our paleontological specs on. I said earlier that this is incontrovertibly a work of fantasy, and that's a position I stand by. But a naive presumption springing from this would be that as a work of fantasy, any mobilization of real science would be at odds with the work's purpose, or at least simply irrelevant. The story is made up. Quite obviously so. It's not intended to teach us about the real world in the way a work of non-fiction would be. In fact, at many points, it is set quite explicitly against our certain knowledge of how the world works. So what's the point of trying to ask what science is doing here? We might begin our answer to this question by looking at Gurney's own scrupulousness regarding technical data. One of the aesthetic cornerstones of Dinotopia is Gurney's intense eye for detail. You can see from pictures like this one that his work isn't remotely figurative, nor is it illustration in the modern cartoonish sense one might expect from the phrase children's dinosaur book. In fact, Gurney seems to be taking his cue from Victorian masters like Lawrence Alma-Tadema and to a lesser extent the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Here's a comparison of Gurney's work with the Pre-Raphaelite Frederick Sandys. You can see that at least superficially, the lines of influence are pretty obvious until one notices the oviraptor at the bottom of Gurney's image. The Pre-Raphaelites, of course, following the ideals of John Ruskin, made truth to nature a centerpiece of their aesthetics. Gurney is a plein air painter, and most of his locations are real. He paints from maquettes to make sure the light is right. And most of the humans in his work are modeled by real people, including Gurney himself, who is the model for the book's protagonist, Arthur Dennison. For the dinosaurs, he is no less scrupulous. He did a lot of painting and drawing in museum halls in order to get the proportions right, read technical papers to make his animals as accurate as possible, and ended up producing dinosaurs which, by 1990 standards, are, I am told, pretty good. This despite the fact that his background prior to Dinotopia was not as a paleoartist, though he went on to do some serious paleo art after this book was published, but as a fantasy and sci-fi cover artist. What do fantasy art, paleo art, and pre-Raphaelitism have in common? As I read it, the most obvious thing is that none of the three has easy access to formal experimentation. Paleo art asks its viewer to trust that it depicts the past accurately, despite the fact that even the least controversial work will necessarily contain surmise and hypothesis, as well as carefully rendered technical inference. Fantasy illustration, meanwhile, is usually intended to convey an alien world with exactly the same camera lens language. Though there are great exceptions, I'm thinking of Cressida Cowell's How to Train Your Dragon series here, which builds a world in the scribbly drawing style of its narrator. The vast majority of fantasy art is commissioned to document a vision, normally someone else's, rather than to stand separately. And just like that, we already find art and science ploughing the same awkward furrow, the crisis of representation. It turns out that this crisis exists not just with regard to images, but with regard to words, charts, tables, and numbers, and that arts and sciences have grappled with them very differently over the years, and in some of the same ways. But speaking to this subject would take me off into broader reaches, and I want to keep things focused on Dinotopia. So for now, let's limit ourselves to the observation that Gurney treats his dinosaur and his human subjects with equal care, and that care requires an interface with the traditions and challenges, both of art history and scientific illustration. But this observation gives rise to an interesting challenge. Why is Gurney concerned with accuracy at all? However correctly he draws the leg of a diplodocus, he's not going to fool anybody into believing that there's an island full of them in the Indian Ocean, nor does he want to. The book is not a hoax. It's sold as fiction. There are ways in which it pretends to be real beyond the art style, by the way, and they're fascinating, but I don't have time to tell you about them. More importantly, the dinosaurs in the text are ludicrously and deliberately inaccurate in some ways. They collaborate with humans, to take the obvious example. Lots of them can talk. They have cities and libraries and governments and rudimentary infrastructure. And the implication is that not all of these things have been provided by the humans with whom they live. When your Protoceratops can speak clear, crisp English, why does it matter how well it's drawn? There's a sort of annoying truism, which I've noticed about dinosaurs in the years I've been thinking about them. It's another both and, actually, which is that nobody knows what a dinosaur looks like, and everyone knows what a dinosaur looks like. Gurney, who is not seeking to educate, could just have taken advantage of that, drawn anything that we recognize as dinosaur-y, and saved himself a lot of museum visits. So why doesn't he? A clue to this answer is to be found in the preface to the book itself, in which Gurney really sees my question coming and doubles down. In the context of my talk today, this piece of writing is so remarkable that I'm going to read you the whole thing. It isn't long. A century and a half ago, Sir Richard Owen coined the word Dinosauria to name what he believed to be fearfully great lizards. We've already seen that this is something of a misrepresentation, but by no means an unusual one in this period or any other. During the time since then, the Earth has coughed up new bones faster than paleontologists can raise them up in marble halls. As we crane our necks upwards, young and old, trying to reclothe those bones with muscle and skin in a kind of reverse X-ray vision, we keep asking ourselves, what were they really like? We have moved into this earthly abode without the benefit of meeting the previous tenants. In this instance, the previous tenants had a lease of 150 million years. They must have got along well with the landlord. This paragraph, by the way, makes me wonder about whether children really are the intended audience of this book, but let me keep reading. The book you hold in your hands is an odyssey for the eye. You can check with the nearest 8-year-old. All the dinosaurs are real, based on fossil evidence. Whether the rest is real depends on you. It belongs in the marble hall, not of the museum, but of your imagination, the other side of the mirror, the world that is in the end more true. Okay, so perhaps you don't need me to tell you why I find these 3 paragraphs utterly compelling. I really hope that's the case, that I don't need to tell you, because I don't have time to tell you all of it. But I want to force your attention in the direction of a few key points. Firstly, this preface is utterly focused on the scientific facts, completely imaginative paraphernalia, the illustration, the map notwithstanding. Secondly, we note that the dinosaurs, the one thing in the book that Gurney hasn't drawn from life, are presented as the most accurate part of the text. The dinosaurs are real. Whether the rest is real depends on you. This is an astonishing statement, I think, from an artist so committed to realism. But of course, the third and final thing I want to point out is that wonderful reversal Gurney pulls in the last sentence, where the rest, presumably meaning everything but the dinosaur biology, becomes real in the imagination, the world that is in the end more true. So what's he saying here? The dinosaurs in this book are scrupulously accurate, but what's in your head is the thing that really matters here, and not in the artwork, is the book's hidden impressionism. The idea that the world of the imagination is more true than truth is, of course, a staple of the fantasy genre more widely. But the evocation of Lewis Carroll's looking glass as the dividing line, there's a boundary metaphor for you, does more than simply gesture at the fantasy pedigree of Gurney's project. Carroll was a mathematician, and his world isn't, as is sometimes presumed, a world of arbitrary whimsy. As scholars like Fran Colt and others have shown, there is a distinct logic underpinning everything which happens when Alice is in Wonderland. Nonsense is not the same as chaos. I presume I don't need to tell this audience that this also holds in fantasy more broadly, despite the lay assumption that the move away from the real world essentially leads to a free-for-all in which the author can do whatever they wish. We all here understand that most of the big fantasy worlds are bound by systemic obligations, whether it's Tolkien's languages, the thermodynamic magic systems of Brandon Sanderson, M.K. Jemison's orogeny, or the color taxonomy of Anne McCaffrey's dragons. Fantasy is not the opposite of fact. In practice, what counts as fact in a fantasy world is every bit as important as what works as one in the actual world, and any number of heated online discussions will attest to this point. And the dinosaurs? They, I think, hold a privileged position in this discussion, for they are absolutely and incontrovertibly the property both of science and fiction. You cannot have a dinosaur. We see historically that you cannot until you have both an international system of paleontology and a mass cultural imaginary habituated to the possibility of other worlds. The ability to reassemble the bones depends on the ability to imagine the bones reassembled. Lucas Ripple has persuasively argued that dinosaur skeletons, reconstructed like Dippy's here, can usefully be thought of as mixed media art installations, which use things like plaster, metal, wood, lighting, sound, fine art, and sometimes, although not in this case, original fossil material, to convey an essence of the living creature. I'm not saying any of this to cast aspersions on the scientific insights which are possible through these assemblages. Rather the contrary. It is through these artistic practices, in part, that the science continues to deepen its insights. And in this context, the way Gurney uses dinosaurs begins to feel far less strange. Dinosaurs have always been fantasy animals. Fantasy is part of how we have animated them. So is computer modeling, so is fieldwork, so is comparative anatomy, so is cladistics, but also fantasy, systematic, but with vacillation. Birds aside, no human has ever seen a living dinosaur, and no human ever will. Yet we, each of us, without thinking, regardless of our prior interest levels, know what one looks like. This truth testifies to 2 centuries of remarkable collaboration between literature and science, a collaboration which was ongoing even as snow sat down to draw the 2 cultures apart from one another. If we want to bring down some of those walls to seek peace, then we could do worse than look at the places where there has been irreducible collaboration all along. Where are the real dinosaurs? In Gurney's book? In the museum? On our screens? In your head? Are the real dinosaurs those of fantasy or those of science? The answer, I think, is yes. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Will. That's absolutely brilliant. And you can see all the claps sort of rising on the screen, which is really nice. It's always difficult with online conferences, isn't it? We would have had the roaring applause now, but yeah, we're simulating it as best as we can. Right, okay, we've got about 16 minutes or so for questions. There are lots of questions on the it's Q&A, so I'm not going, I have hundreds of my own, but I'm going to be good, and I'm going to stick to the questions from the audience. I think I'm going to start with one that's a slightly bigger one, and that comes from Meg, from Meg Horridge. You touched on this a little, but regarding what was mentioned about snow straddling science and literature, do you think it's particularly important for science fiction writers or critics to engage with science? I would say actually science fiction and fantasy more generally, but anyway, are the best science fiction fantasy writers also scientists? There's definitely been a tradition of that in the past, but is that, if we think about what you're saying from the other way around, from the practitioner's perspective, how would you answer that question?
My goodness me. Yeah, thank you, Meg, and thank you, Dimitra, as well. Thank you for everyone pressing that clap emoji. I appreciate it. Yes. Do I think it's particularly important? I don't think it's my job as a literary critic to be able to answer a question like that, to be honest, Meg. I think that what I'm trying to do is point something out. It's the old hard and soft science fiction battle again, I suppose, in some ways. This isn't it, like, what is our obligation to the real science? Should we be real scientists? Real scientists. Real scientists have written some amazing science fiction books and some terrible ones. And the same is true of non-scientists as well. Wells is an interesting example because he trains as a scientist, doesn't have an eye for the detail work, drops out, and then becomes, one of the legendary sci-fi authors of history. Implying perhaps that a little is the right answer, that you want to be kind of like trained enough not to mess up, but not so trained that you lose your ability to kind of grasp on to what's important on the fiction side of it. Frankly, I don't think there's an answer to your question that doesn't involve prescribing what science fiction or fantasy should be. And I'm not here for that. I think that's putting up walls rather than bringing them down. And as I've tried to show in that talk, my approach to scholarship generally is that of a pacifist. And I think wherever we can avoid tying ourselves to definitions like that, we probably should. That's a bit of a mealy answer, but I hope that gives you some sense of how I feel about it.
I think that's fair enough, Will. Thank you. There's a few questions about very specific things, so I'll move to those very quickly. Sylvia wants to know more about Mark Whitten's art for your cover. And could you tell us a bit more about that?
I got the question that I wanted. Yes, thank you for reading the slide. Just very, very briefly, Mark Whitten is a brilliant British paleo artist, one of the best currently working. I am biased in that because I've co-written something with him recently, and he's allowed me to use that picture for the cover. What it is it's a picture of the Crystal Palace dinosaur, the iguanodon from the Crystal Palace, which some of you will know, those big kind of old retro Victorian things. But what he's done is he's drawn it, he hasn't drawn a picture of the sculpture, right? He's drawn, I'm just getting the slide again. he's drawn the creature as if it were living. So let me just pop it back for you. Here we go. There we are. So with babies, right? It doesn't have babies. It could never have babies because this is obsolete, right? This thing never existed. Whatever we know about dinosaurs, we know there was nothing like this ever in history, ever. There's a sadness there. And so then Mark Whitten, who is a very serious paleo artist who knows, who draws real iguanodons, he knows exactly what they look like, and he does this instead because he's paying tribute to the older form of the dinosaur that lives on in our imagination, and he allows it to breed because you can't get a dinosaur out of the public consciousness as easily as you can get it in. So that's what's going on with that cover. I love that artwork. I think I actually still find it quite moving, but that's probably just because I've been writing this book for too long. Anyway, yes, thank you for giving me that question.
Yeah, so 2 layers of fantasy there, which is always good, always good. Okay, question from Mercury. Thank you for the keynote. It brought to mind for me that in 1984, the foundational anime Dragon Ball played with talking dinosaurs in a fantastic setting. Do you know anything about the Japanese angle on this? I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about the Japanese angle on this topic. And was this anime involved in the conversation at all?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Mercury, you're exactly right. It's not my specialist area. I can't claim expertise as an anime person or as knowing anything about Japan particularly. But you can't talk about dinosaurs, especially in the mid-20th century, without Japan coming up, in part because of Godzilla. And actually, one of the early things I had to decide when I was starting this project was whether Godzilla counts. Because if Godzilla is a dinosaur, then there's an extra couple of pairs of chapters you have to write. And there are ways in which he's dinosaur-y and ways in which he isn't. One of the things that I didn't quite have time to join up in the time that I had is that wherever you find them in the world, dinosaurs are very often deliberately wedded to ideas of nation. We speak of British dinosaurs and American dinosaurs and Chinese dinosaurs as if Britain, America, and China existed in any political or geographical way 66 million years ago. There's nothing, if you looked at a map of the world without geological training, you could never even guess at where those places were. And Britain was almost completely underwater at that time. So what does it mean to have a British dinosaur? It's a kind of insane thing that we do. But dinosaurs turn up in national contexts all the time. They turn up on flags, on money, and of course in national museums. They're part of how countries identify themselves, and Japan's no different. It takes on the dinosaur in a very specific way of its own. So yeah, absolutely.
There's even a couple of names of dinosaurs from countries, aren't there? I can't think of one now, but I'm sure, I've got a young child, so that's how I know these things. There you go. Okay, question from Tim, which is a bigger one again. He's asking if you know Svetlana Boym's chapter about dinosaurs and nostalgia, which I'm sure you do. He says that he can't think about dinosaurs without thinking about the relationship with childhood and how childhood's been constructed, which, as you said, in terms of Dinotopia, complicates in interesting ways all of what this book is trying to do, right? You've got the pre-Raphaelite aesthetics, but also a child audience in mind, potentially. So he's asking whether your interest here in science and the two cultures, how might it bear on the ways that children are addressed and educated, especially in terms of STEM subjects or elsewhere, which is a huge debate at the moment, I know, but
it certainly is. Tim, that's a great question. I'm really grateful for it. I've several times now as I've sort of hinted a few times now, I've been working on this book for slightly too long, and so it's happened a few times that I tell someone what I'm up to, and they're like, "Oh, so you do children's literature?" And it's sort of, I was taken aback by it the first couple of times. I was like, well, there's so obviously dinosaurs turn up in children's things and they turn up in adult things. And by the way, they turn up in very adult things sometimes. If you don't know that, I'm not going to send you Googling, but they are not the exclusive property of children. We have this idea that they are. And one of the things that I've been wrestling with from the beginning is where do we get this idea that dinosaurs are for children, which is an absolutely ludicrous thing to say. If I told you that bats are for grown-ups or that anteaters are for West Indian people, that's just an insane thing to say. But Dinosaurs Are for Children, which is exactly that level of logical plausibility, is for some reason something that we've all swallowed. And the interesting thing about it is that it's comparatively recent. You start getting children's oriented dino stuff in the Boy's Own paper, I would say in the 1900s, places like that. But really it's from the 1940s plus that we have a children's publishing market that's sort of that's dinosaur specific. So what's going on there? Listen, my answer to that is book length, and and it's not a good answer. It's something I'm still really thinking about. Lots of other critics have explained it in different ways. You mentioned Boehm. For W.J.T. Mitchell, it's this idea that the dinosaur is the first time, Dimitri, you just mentioned your son, it's the first time that you get to display a competence that your parent doesn't have. You can learn all the long names and kind of start to feel independent intellectually a little bit because you know something your parents don't. There are these older ideas, these Jungian ideas of sort of big, fierce dead, that kind of stuff, and how the dinosaur is primarily interesting. All of these things kind of work. None of them completely hit it for me. And I think, to be honest with you, Tim, it's still something that I'm pondering, because there's no way of slicing it that makes completely logical sense to me. And also because, I don't have the competence because I'm not a children's fantasy person, and you need to talk to Dimitra.
Interestingly, Dimitra Nicolaidou on the chat was saying there's the parallel of fantasies for children for some people as well. There's something interesting here in the connections you are bringing together in the talk. Okay, one more question from the Q&A. That's a specific one as well. So from Andy, did Gurney ever switch to illustrating dinosaurs with feathers in keeping with changing paleontological understanding? That's quite recent though, isn't it?
Yeah, no, but he did. Thank you, Andy. Brilliant question. So the feathers, for those of you who don't know, and sometimes people really do need catching up on this. So we now understand the majority of dinosaur species to either have been feathered or to have the sort of the spiny bits you get before they turn into feathers on at least parts of their body. And that's uncontroversial now and has been for a while. The definitive proof is the discovery of Microraptor gui in 1996, which is, of course, firstly, it's a Chinese specimen. And so, we're back on the nationalism thing again. Some people continue to refuse to accept Chinese dinosaurs, right? Because they don't want the feathers. But there's also something nationalist and almost certainly racist going on with that as well. What does Gurney do? Well, you've got a problem, okay, when there's a new discovery, if what you're doing is a franchise, because he's doing a series of books. And when he did the first one, a few people thought there might be feathers, but there was no obligation to feathers. By the time he does the third one, the feathers are pretty uncontroversial. So he has the same problem that Jurassic Park has, right? First movie 1993, and then the third one is 2001. So what do you do? And it's interesting what they do. The Jurassic Park franchise doubles down, right? No feathers. And still now we get a Utahraptor or something like it in the most recent Jurassic World movie that's feathery. But what the Jurassic Park movies do is they say, well, these are human creations. They're made by cloning. They're not the real dinosaurs, so they're going to look like this. What Gurney does is he populates a new region of Dinotopia of the island called Chandara with carefully and accurately drawn feathery dinosaurs, and he has them existing alongside these older invalidated ones. I think your question is perhaps bigger than it looks on the surface, because what you're really doing there is you're saying, okay, when you are scientifically scrupulous in creating a fantasy world, and then there's a divergence afterwards, is your duty to the science or to the world you already created, right? So for the Jurassic Park movies, to make the raptors feathery in a later version of the movie would be a plot inconsistency. It would break faith with the fans of the original movie, right? And so the decision there is, that's better. Yeah, exactly, Andy. Scientific canon or literary canon, which is more important? And the interesting thing about fantasy franchising and how fandom works and everything is that literary canon nearly always wins that fight, even with works where they've tried to be quite scrupulous in how they created the world in the first place. So it's a brilliant question, and actually Gurney's take on it is a very specific one. He just kind of opens up this new realm with these lovely. There is in fact, the emperor of Chandara is a Microraptor, which is the first feathered dinosaur. About a sort of big magpie. Imagine a big magpie with 4 wings instead of 2. And he draws it very, for me, very beautifully.
Lovely, lovely. So also, I mean, that's an elegant solution, though, isn't it? To sort of keep both ways and sort of expand the world in a way that sort of seems within expectations of world building, not that problematic. Yeah. Okay. All right. Last chance for any last question. I can feel people feeling for their lunch at this point. I was going to ask a bigger sort of question about, what is fantasy really and what is science, which is what you started us with, right? Isn't in the European, the language, in the European is a fantasy, isn't it? It's something we've reconstructed from the past. Isn't the whole past a fantasy, the way we narrativize or think about, the past? What's the beginning of the go-between? The past is a foreign country, they do things differently there, right? So yeah, all sorts of amazing ideas really here to think about. And also, this divide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's right. And I think the bit of the book I'm trying to write at the moment is basically this, Dimitra, that it says, we've got to start thinking of the Mesozoic past as a fantasy world, not in the sense that it's made up out of the human imagination, although in part at least it is, but in the sense that, like an act of fantasy world building, it is created by consensus according to rules and in ways that kind of shape human understanding of the world they really live in. And so it's about seeing that science and literature are engaged in something parallel. You'll know the exact quotation, I suspect, Dimitra, but that bit where Tolkien says that writing Middle-earth doesn't feel like invention, it feels like discovery. It feels like he's exploring something that's already there. So I think there's a real parallel to be explored in terms of how world building works and how science works. Certainly my very, very limited experience of world building, and thank you for mentioning my choose your own book at the beginning, but my very limited experience of trying to do world building of my own it entirely matches that. It doesn't feel like I'm just coming up with stuff I want to. It feels like I'm sailing around the next headland myself and looking at what's there. I don't know what others, I'm sure there are people with lots more writing experience in the chat who can confirm or deny, but yeah. So can we talk about fantasy world building as being scientific in some way, if only to unsettle that perceived oppositeness that is the real target, I suppose, of what I'm doing. Anyway, sorry, it's past.
No, that's fine. We've hit past, and that's actually a really good note to end. Really, it sort of brought together a lot of your threads all in one go. Right. So shall we just all thank Will once more for an amazing first keynote of GIFCon 2023? Again, you can see the claps rising on the screen, etc., etc. So please go and have a lunch break, everyone, now, and we're back for our next panels at 14:50. Thank you again very much, Will. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and to my deputy chair, Madeline Wall. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks.